Welcome to the Q&A webinar for 101 Mixing Tricks, Big Studio Tricks with a Small Studio. And I'm Bobby Osinski, as you well know by now. For some people that are seeing this for the first time, you may not know me. And I'm the guy that put together 101 mixing tricks, although I have to say they're not all my mixing tricks. They're tricks I've collected from some of the best mixers in the world. And I hope you're enjoying them. So first of all, let's go to the first question from Norm. My question is, how much spread is common between tracks in a mix? Am I being liberal with 10-point spans? Can less pan be used and still give a big quality? First of all, shout out to Randy. I see Randy's here. Tim from Nashville. Kevin from Northern Virginia. Welcome, everyone. So getting to Norm's question here. How much spread between tracks in a mix? It really depends. You'll find that many times wide spreads may be too wide. So in other words, if things are panned far left and far right, it can actually cause you some problems because it can be too wide. And here's why. If you're playing something back in a live environment and there's a very wide spread, the people that are on the left-hand side won't hear what's on the right-hand side, and vice versa. So sometimes, and if, for instance, a track is cut off, let's say there's a playback, and it could be over any kind of medium, and only the left channel is being heard, for instance, then there's a lot of things that aren't in the mix. So you have to put that in consideration when you come to big spreads. So that being said, here's another thing, like with drums, for instance, it's very common to pan hard left and hard right, but usually you're not hearing things that way in a live environment. You're hearing them spread, but you're not hearing them spread way left and right unless you're standing right over the drummer, right in front of the kick drum. So many times that's not a natural sound. So when it says here, when Norm says, am I being liberal with 10-point spans? Maybe, maybe not, because it really depends how it works in the mix. Sometimes something that's has a real wide span just sounds disjointed in the mix. So I'm going to have to say that it really does depend on the mix, and you have to be careful spreading things too wide, contrary to popular belief. It's just kind of what works. Bad answer, I understand, but really every song is different, every arrangement is different, and you have to take that in consideration. What I do is I usually don't spread anything hard left or hard right, and almost ever, unless there's a really good reason. It has to be very dramatic. Usually, you know, it'll be out by 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock might be the farthest I'll spread something, and maybe even less. It's dramatic and less dramatic, but it works better in the context of the song many times. Norm also has another question. How does anyone use the hot loud and go to the high low level? Would there even be any advantage to the sequence? Okay, I think what he means is right in the first module, there's two tricks, the hot and loud mixing trick and high and low level trick, multi-level listening trick. So basically the way this works is you should get your levels hot and loud, make everything sound really good, really big, and you're doing this mostly at a moderate level. The reason why you're listening at 3 different levels, you're listening only for a brief time at a very loud level, and I mean loud enough that you can gauge the low end. So you're getting the low end, you're feeling good, you know where everything sits, and then you'll power down to a medium level, a moderate level, where you'll do the majority of your mixing. And at this point, you're going to make sure the levels are hot. So you're going to put everything on the mix bus that you need during the course of this. And then towards the end is when you actually go to a low level. and that determines your final balances. So this is only happening more towards the end of the mix. After you think you've balanced everything up and it feels good, that's when you actually go to the very lowest level. Many engineers can listen at a very low level for most of the mix and make it work, and others can't. So really, it's up to you. I know a few that they listen at incredibly low levels for the entire mix, and it always sounds great. I always listen at a moderately loud level, and towards the end, and when I say towards the end, it might be the last half hour or something like that, I will balance everything up at a very low level, do the final balances. So Norm, I hope that answers your question. Let's go to the next one. This is from Martin. One question, can you give some detail about the mic positioning for the micropanning trick? I was just wondering how to generate stereo snare or hi-hat. Okay, I think there's some misunderstanding about the micropanning trick. The micropanning works really well, and the micropanning trick talks a lot about the stereo track, for instance, and how you wouldn't pan that hard left and hard right, and how you might pan it to maybe 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. So it would just be there'd be a spread, but it wouldn't be very, very wide. So things that are mono, like snares and hi-hats and things like that, you wouldn't generate them in stereo. It really doesn't happen that way. So what you're doing is you're panning that to where you normally would. Many people will pan the snare just slightly off to the right, because with the right-handed drummer, because that's the way you see it. Many people will keep the snare in the center. The hi-hat will go off maybe I would say maybe 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock on the right, because that's the way you see it, and that's the way you hear it. And your overheads will be somewhere like that, somewhere around there. So if it isn't already in stereo, you're not going to regenerate it as stereo. That doesn't really help you. So this is when micropanning trick is more having to do with things that were recorded in stereo originally, like, for instance, keyboards. So the big one, it's usually recorded in stereo. The other one, some guitars, if you record them in stereo. Anything that you originally record in stereo, and it's usually not all that much this applies to. So I hope that helps, Martin. Here's the next question by Alwyn. Hey, Bobby, if you use this technique, what can I do if it starts conflicting with the trick? Can I use trick number 50? And if so, what should I listen to pre-process and post-process? Okay, this is trick number 44, which actually is not the individual track parallel compression trick. It's the track number, let's see, 44 and 50. And let me just check. Sometimes I forget which ones are which myself. So number 44 is the boost filter, the bass filter boost trick, and number 50 is the kick and bass balancing trick. Okay, so here's the way it works. Generally speaking, you're more concerned with the balance between the kick and the bass, or the kick and snare and the bass. So you're going to go to trick number 50 first, and you're going to get that together. And then if the bass doesn't fit well, then you're going to go to trick number 44, which is the filter trick, the filter boost trick. And basically what that means is you're going to filter off the lower end of the bass and then boost it at where the cutoff frequency is, if it doesn't happen naturally already. And you'll find that suddenly it will fit in better with the kick and with the snare. So really, you're trying to balance everything up first, and if you can't get that balance, then you go to this other trick, the trick number 44, in order to do it. So I hope that helps, Owen. Again, before you do any kind of processing trick, try to balance everything up naturally, and only do processing if it's not working. So many times it's better to just put the faders up and listen without anything EQ or EQ'd or compressed, and just hear how things are working. And then from there, then you start a process, and you'll find that things will work out a lot better and it will sound a lot more natural. If you put one instrument up and solo it, for instance, and you try to process it and then fit it in the mix, many times it won't fit very well. So, better off listen to the whole mix a lot while you're doing this. All right, next question is from Roger. Hi, Bobby. This is one of my favorites so far, and he's referring to trick number 23, the Abbey Road reverb trick, and inspired me to sign up for 101 mixing tricks. Well, cool. I was having trouble with making my reverb sit well in my mixes and was searching for a method to elevate that. After watching this, I applied the technique immediately as part of my workflow. I've gotten nothing but positive feedback on my mixes. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's really a problem that we all have at one point in time or another, where the reverb kind of sounds good on its own and doesn't fit in the track and sticks out and sounds like there's too much reverb, and when you turn back it sounds like not enough. And the Abbey Road reverb trick, where you filter out the highs and lows, really fixes that, where it tailors the reverb so it just acts like a glue and fits better in the mix and doesn't necessarily stick out unless you really wanted to, unless you pour a lot of reverb on the track, which is, again, makes it sound really good. So yeah, Roger, I'm glad this worked for you, because it's a good trick. I have to say, it works really well, and it's worked really well for me too. Next question from Greg. He has a number of questions here. First of all, do you mix through the vintage warmer? Do you mix through the EQ or add it after the fact? Well, I use, as one of my compressors on the mix bus, I use a PSP vintage warmer, which I like quite a bit. And yes, I always mix through it. So at the beginning of the mix, I will set that up, and I'll also set a limiter up. And the reason why you want to, I'll also put an SSL bus compressor up as well. And I won't use much of any of them, by the way. Just barely have the mix touching them. Just a dB here and a dB there, at least when it starts. The reason why you want to put these up at the beginning of the mix is because if you get your balance up and then you insert a compressor later in the mix, you'll find the balance will change, because the compressor will work on different frequencies differently, and each one does this. So you add the compressor in later in the mix, and now you might have to go back and rebalance everything or re-EQ things, because it will just sound different. So that's why I always put it up at the beginning. And again, most mixers will do that too. And second half of the question, do you mix through the EQ or add it after the fact? Generally speaking, after the fact, and only if there's something missing from the mix. And it could be that it just needs some high end, because it's missing some brilliance, and rather than going back and putting it on every track or finding out which track it's kind of missing, sometimes it's easier to just put it on the stereo bus. It's the same thing with the low end. You might find that, oh, you're missing some deep bass, some 40 cycles, and you could go back and you could play with your kick and your snare or kick and bass. Sometimes it's just easier to put a little of that 40, 50, 60, whatever it might be, on the stereo bus. Greg also has another question. At what point do you stop and leave stuff for mastering? Let's look at the third half of the question. I'm not going to have it mastered, then can I have the master fader peak at around 0? If I'm going to have it mastered, how much headroom should I leave? Yeah, this is all related. Okay, so it used to work differently than it does now. It used to be that you would put any compression, any EQ, you'd put it on for the client. So any reference mix that you gave to the client would have that compression and that EQ, so the client would hear what it's going to sound like when it hits the radio, for instance. And that's kind of changed. And then what you do, you take that off the mix bus when you and then you'd give a version without any compression or any bus EQ. That's what you give to the mastering engineer. Anymore, that's not the case. Anymore, what you put on your master bus is that mix is usually what you're going to give to the mastering engineer. And it doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing to do, because usually if you leave that stuff for the mastering engineer, it winds up being better. It's just that everybody is so used to the sound of their mix by the end that they don't want to change it too much. And I'm even the same way anymore. What I will do is I'll back off of any kind of serious compression and any kind of huge amounts of makeup gain. So, for instance, I will, instead of pushing the level up to 0 or to minus 0.1 or where we're just below 0 dB full scale, instead of pushing it up high, I won't do that. I'll leave lots of headroom. And, you know, if it's 4 dB, 5 dB, it doesn't matter. I'll leave it for the mastering engineer and let them do it. And usually at that point, they have something to work with and they can do a better job. So the best thing I can say, Greg, is don't push it real hard. Don't push the compression or the limiting really hard, and maybe take off the EQ as well and give that to the mastering engineer instead. That being said, there are mixers that will crush their mix and give that to the mastering engineer, but I have to tell you that most mastering engineers hate that, and they just feel like they're hamstrung and they can't do their best when that happens. So I hope that answers your question, Greg. Questions? Oh, Greg has another question, and this is about trick number 28, the never miss quick effects trick, I think. If we were using Easy Drum or Slate drums or most other drum plugins, is it safe to bypass this and many other mixing tips for drums? As you know, they all have great presets with effects ready to go. You know, again, it's whatever works. If it sounds great already in the track, if the preset sounds great, then why change anything? You know, if it's working just fine, don't do anything. You know, it's the same with electric guitars frequently. You don't have to do anything to them because they're usually recorded pretty well and the sound, you know, is pretty good in many cases. So why do anything in the mix? So if something sounds good already, don't process it just for the sake of processing it. So I'd say, you know, you get a great preset and the effects are ready to go and you're happy with it, then great. Then you don't need to do anything. You're lucky. Okay, next one from Eddie. Oh, dramatic panning trick. Hey, Bobby, how can I do this in Logic Pro? Because I only have one pan knob, and this has come up a bunch of times. And the dramatic panning trick is talking about stereo panning for the most part. So you have a stereo track and how you're going to pan it in the mix. You're going to pan it hard left to hard right, or you're going to pan it in a little bit, or you're going to pan it, like I said before, to maybe 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock. And Logic Pro, and I haven't checked this out myself, and I should, seems to have only one panning knob. I think that it must be a mono track if it only has one panning knob, because stereo, you can't, you know, adjust stereo very well, unless the panning knob, in fact, is a balance control, and that's kind of different. So, Eddie, I can't tell you. I have to look at Logic Pro to figure this out, but I think if there's only one pan knob, it's a mono track. And if it isn't a mono track, it's not a pan knob, it's a balance control. And balance control is, you know, more or less balancing the level between the left and right. And that's, you know, completely different than what the trick is talking about. Okay, next question from Roger. Hey, Bobby, how do you calculate the pre-delay time for a track? Good question. So the first thing you need is the tempo of the track, and usually if you have the tempo of the track, there are some formulas, and you can look around online and get those formulas, or if you want, I'll happy to give you the formulas in a comment section. But most digital audio workstations now will give you the tempo of the track, and will allow you to synchronize your delays anyway to the track. So it will give you delay times. So for instance, if you know your delay time on, let's just say it's an eighth note delay and it's 172 beats per minute. Well, in order to get the pre-delay for the track, you could take 172 and use that as your pre-delay, but it's usually going to be way, way long, way too long. Sometimes not, but most of the time it's way too long for a pre-delay. So cut it in half. And if you cut that in half, it becomes 86, I think. Am I right? It becomes, yes, it becomes 86 milliseconds. So even that might be too long. And if that's too long, cut it in half again. So it's 43 milliseconds. And sometimes that's a pretty good time right in there. Anywhere in the 20 to 40 millisecond range is a good pre-delay time for your reverb. If 43 is still too long, cut it in half again. So it becomes 21.5 or 22. And you'll find that's a pretty good. And when you get down that low on a pre-delay time, you really can't tell the difference anyway. It's kind of a ballpark thing that you're trying to get. But that's how you get your pre-delay time. Just find out what the normal delay time of the track, the tempo of the track, find the delay time for an eighth note or a quarter note, and then just continue to cut it in half until you get the right pre-delay time for the reverb. Okay, I hope that answered your question, Roger. Let's go to the next one. Oh, that's it. So let's go to live Q&A. We already have one from Randy, and he says, "Hey, hi Bobby, I recently mixed a song consisting of vocals and drums and distorted guitar only, and no bass, not like the White Stripes. I tried adding more low end to the guitar to make up for lack of bass. The guitar felt like it lost its edge. Do you have any techniques in mind for a bassless song?" Well, yeah, and by the way, if anybody has any questions, now's the time to answer them. Just type them in the message box there, and I'll be happy to answer it for you. Well, generally speaking, what ends up happening, and just if we're looking at the broad spectrum of mixes, the more elements you have in a mix, the more things you have going on, usually the smaller everything has to get. And the fewer things you have going on in the mix, the fewer elements, the bigger everything has to get. So, for instance, if you only have 3 elements, in this case you have drums, vocals, and guitar, that means that all 3 have to be pretty big to fill up the space in the mix. And when I say space, I mean the frequency space. If you added a lot of bottom and it didn't work for you, took off the edge, it probably means that you're emphasizing the wrong frequencies. So it could be that you're EQing too high, and it could mean that you're EQing way too low. So what I would say is that you have to experiment with the frequency that you're boosting. So for instance, with the drums, in this case, you'd probably have a very big sounding kick drum. And you probably have a big sounding snare. If you're losing the edge, it means something is conflicting with it. It could be that the vocal is conflicting. It could mean that the snare drum or the cymbals are conflicting. So you would just have to find out the frequencies that are getting in the way. It might be cymbals. A lot of times cymbals are in the same frequency range as an electric guitar, a distorted guitar. So you might want to notch those out a little bit at 3K or 4K or somewhere in there, and you'll get your edge back. And sometimes you find that maybe you don't need like 40 cycles or 50 cycles or something. If you're adding, boost there, you'd probably be better off going up at 120 or something in there, maybe even 240 to add some fullness. So it all depends on the frequencies that you're adding here to make things sound big. So I hope I helped you there, Andy. Randy. Alberto asks, hey Bob, I've been trying to get into MS recording and mixing. Can you go through a few steps to a simple recording and mixing for drums and guitars? Okay, not a lot of people use MS, and they probably should because it's a cool technique. Now, here's what MS is. When you record something in stereo, there's a lot of information that's common to both the left and the right channel. And all that common information comes up the middle. So that's the M of MS. It's the mid, as they would call it. MS is mid-side recording. And M, the mid stuff, is all the stuff that's common to the left and right channel. Now, on the other hand, there are things that are different in the left and right channel as well that are out on the sides. And of course, that's the side part, the S side of MS. So that's they call it the difference information, but basically what it means is it's stuff that is different in the left channel from the right channel and vice versa. Well, the thing about MS in mixing anyway is now if we have that stereo, something in stereo, we're able to control the level of all the stuff that's in the middle or all the stuff that's out on the sides. Now, not only can we control the level, but we can also EQ it, so we can control the frequency response as well. So this is very powerful because what will end up happening is something that's in stereo, for instance, that's getting in the way of a vocal or you know, kick or a snare. All we'd have to do is bring the M portion of MS down, the mid stuff, and all of a sudden, just by lowering the level a little bit, we still hear it because it's in stereo. We hear it out in the left and right, but it's not clouding up the mix any longer. So that works really well. Sometimes by just EQing the S part of the MS, we find that we can make that really brilliant. We can have it stand out. So that's the big thing of MS. So I hope that that's going to help you there. What I would do is, you know, if you're going to record some things in MS, then what I would do, it's a very interesting technique. It really works well. But, you know, you have to do it with MS mixing in mind as well. So just recording it is only half the battle. You have to mix it as well. Usually it works, MS mixing works better if you just have something that's recorded normally in stereo. But it's a good trick. And mastering engineers use that an awful lot. I was just at Universal Mastering yesterday with Pete Dell, and he made a big point of that, how much he used it. So it's a big time mastering engineer that uses it all the time. Looks like we just dumped out here of something. I don't know what happened, guys. Let's see. Our Hangout just lost something. Hang on, everybody. See what happened here. And we just lost everything here. I hope you're with me. Hang on. Let me see if I can get it all back. All right. I'm back here. Let's see. You know what? I seem to have lost everybody's chat, unfortunately. I don't know what happened there. It just kind of dumped out of Google Hangouts. If I missed your question, please give it to me again. And let's see. Okay, I found it someplace else here. See, Richard says, I found your trick number 4, that the magic micropanning trick, particularly after listening to someone's broadcast after 2 years ago, who advocated a more simplistic left, right, center style mixing. Author's view is that the finer panning can muddy up the stereo image. What's your take? Well, you know, to each his own, first of all. Oh, by the way, if you're not seeing me, refresh your screen. Just do a refresh and it should be back. Okay? I hope you're listening. And also, just do me a favor, if you can hear me, just drop me a note here in the chat that you can hear me. But refresh your screen if the screen went away, and hopefully it will come back. Okay, to answer Richard's question about left, right, center style mix, you know, a lot of people do that, but frankly, the majority of mixers that I know, and I'm talking about the A-list guys for the most part, okay, Kevin says everything is okay, good. Those guys don't pan too much hard left and hard right. So you'll find that most of them will just never venture there. So, you know, if you're just going to go hard left, hard right, or center, your mixes are going to be pretty boring. One of the reasons why is, especially with stuff that's stereo, after it all gets panned, let's just say you have 4 or 5 stereo things. So you have 2 keyboards and you pan them hard left and hard right. And you have your drum mix, your overheads, and you pan them hard left and hard right. And you have a stereo guitar and you pan it hard left and hard right. And you have vocals that are panned hard left and hard right. Well, what ends up happening is something that a good friend of mine, Ed C., one of the top Nashville mixers, he calls that big mono. And big mono winds up being just that. It becomes kind of like you can't hear anything because everything else is covering each other up. All these stereo tracks are all panned on top of one another, so they cover everything up. And that's one of the reasons why we do the micro panning, because rather than having to add EQ or anything, we could have, just by panning, we can find a hole in the mix so you can hear it. So you don't have to add EQ, you don't have to add more compression or more processing. That's what micropanning is finding a hole so you can hear everything. And this is especially important if you have a lot of things going on at the same time. If you start to pan things on top of one another, then you're having them all, you're having something cover something else up. So you have to do a lot of EQ carving in order to hear it all. And the micropanning essentially helps that. So what it will do is it will get you to a point where without having to do processing, suddenly things can jump out of the mix, and that's why you do it. So I hope that that works for you. I forget who asked, and I don't see it here on my screen, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But anyway, again, if all you're going to do is hard left, hard right, and center, usually that's going to make a boring mix. Let's see. Randy says, "Hi, Bobby. I'm cutting a podcast for a friend. I know the source is not terrific. It's very airy sounding. What can I do to cut that air sound?" I'm not sure I know what you mean, Randy. When you say air, do you mean like air conditioning? You're hearing a lot of noise, like airy noise, like that? No, that was Richard. That's the question. Okay. Cool, Richard. Yeah, I'm glad I answered your question. I'm glad you understand. So, Randy, let me know, what do you mean by airy sounding? You mean like air conditioning? If that's what you mean, there's not much you can do. You can go to Isotope, for instance, and you can use one of the denoiser, decracklers, one of those things. It's an expensive package, and it takes some time to master, but it does work. It does clean up things quite a lot. Occasionally I use it, but you know, I just try to record things well to begin with, so you don't have to deal with that. But really, there's not a lot of things that you can do if you're getting a poor source. You know, if there's a lot of high frequencies that are getting in the way, if they happen to take up one part of the spectrum, you can notch that out. And this is where a spectrum analyzer sometimes comes in handy. Put a spectrum analyzer across it and see if there's just one frequency that's boosted up. And if there's one frequency that you see that tends to just be there all the time, that could be your noise. And by just decreasing that one frequency band, you could get rid of a lot of it. You won't get rid of everything, but you'll get rid of a lot of it. So that's, one thing you can do right there. Generally speaking, though, noise is broadband, and it's very difficult to get rid of. It can be done. Isotope, again, has the best package for that, to get rid of any kind of noises. But it's not one of those things that you can learn right off the top. It takes some time, and it is expensive as well. But it does do a good job after you know how to use it. So if there's anybody else that has any questions, let me know here. I don't see anything else up. One thing I'm going to ask you, though, before I let everybody go, I want to ask something from you. I want to do this poll here. So which would you like to see the best out of all of these particular? If I was going to start some new courses here, what would you like to see? Or what kind of new tricks would you like to see out of it? Would you like to see effects tricks or vocal tricks or instrument tricks? What would you find most useful? So if you can just tell me there, that would be really helpful to me. Okay, Randy says, thanks so much about the air question. Okay, so I must have answered your question then. And again, if anybody else has any more questions, now's the time. Could be about anything. If it's a recording question, that's cool too. Okay, right now I see EQ and compression techniques, and a lot of you like instrument tricks. It's funny, last time I asked this, everybody wanted drum and percussion tricks. Oh, now it's changing here. I see vocal tricks, instrument tricks, EQ tricks. Here's another thing I want to ask. I'm going to be starting some new courses pretty soon, or developing some new courses, go along with 101 mixing tricks, or just offering some courses. There's some people I know that have some great courses that I think might be useful to you, and I just want to find out what you guys think, if you find it useful. I'm going to end this poll right now. We're going to start another one. So let me just see. Here, let's do another one. And what module did you find useful? So help me out with that. Okay, Alberto has a question. Yeah. Ask it. And Randy also says, I like EQ help. I think that's weakness. Okay. Jean-Luc asks, hi, Bobby. When miking a guitar amp, is it essential to put the volume at maximum when recording, especially when recording in the control room? No, you put it, well, if you mean the volume on the guitar, yes. If you mean on the amplifier, no. And let's just assume you're talking about the guitar, and just hit me back and let me know if that's what you're talking about. One of the reasons why you want to keep it at 0, you want to keep it up all the way, is the fact that you get the best frequency response. As you begin to turn it down, two things can happen. Either the high end will roll off, or you'll find just the high end will only be there. It's the low end that rolls off, so it'll get thinner. And it really depends on the guitar and what kind of volume control it's using. But if you want the full frequency response of the instrument, then what you do is you would put it up all the way. As far as an amplifier, you just set it to where it sounds good. And sometimes it's best if it's cranking. I much prefer a cranked guitar amp to anything with pedals in front of it, to be honest with you. Oh, okay, Jean-Luc says, I mean the volume of the amp. Yeah, it depends. You put it to where it sounds really good. And it's different for every amplifier, and it's different for every track. So it's hard for me to say. If I have, it's funny, tomorrow I'm going to be recording, I'm going to be doing guitar overdubs, and the player has a wide variety of amplifiers that we'll use, and sometimes we'll, a wide variety of guitars. Depending on the guitar, we might use the amplifier at one setting, and with another guitar we might use it at another setting. It depends how it fits in the track, so there's not one size fits all, Jean-Luc. So just you know, if you want it overdriven, good overdriven sound, crank it up all the way. If you want it cleaner, don't crank it up. And that's kind of the best thing I can say. Alberto says, I saw online someone's using a hard compressor on a bass hip hop song. Said it was compressing 20 dB. Trick or something you can recommend for hip hop tracks. Well, I wouldn't put it on the mix bus, but Alberto, sometimes you'll do that, and the reason why you'll limit something with a huge amount, and I won't say 20 dB, it's whatever works for the song, but you'll do it sometimes because you want that bass to be really solid, not to move in the track, not to have any dynamics, and that's especially true with hip hop and EDM. So you'll usually, you know, limit it or compress it a lot harder. But especially if it's a synthesizer bass, generally speaking, it's not moving too much anyway in terms of level. It's usually at the same level. If it's a player, then it, you know, could be dynamics. Different notes will sound different. Like if it's a bass player, different places on the guitar, there'll be notes that will boom, and there'll be other ones that you won't hear too well. And it depends on the instrument, how well balanced the instrument is, and then in the player, if the players, you know, can play consistently. So, in many cases, you have to compress it more, so every note can be heard at the same level. So, you'd put it on the bass. You'd never put it on the mix bus, especially with that much. But you know, again, I like to actually compress the bass or limit the bass 12 to 1, 20 to 1, you know, pretty hard, so it doesn't move too much for a lot of tracks anyway. I can't say for everything because it depends on the song. But yeah, it's a good technique. It works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, there's no one thing that will work on every song. Okay, Richard says, I'm still in intermediate phase, and I've heard the difference between a pro mix and amateur mix often be a lot of fine-tuning and automation. At this phase of my development, how much time should I allocate to tweaking a mix before I hit diminishing returns? That's changed a lot from the way it used to be. All of our mixes used to be a day and a half. So what would happen would be you'd set it up in the early part of the day and you'd mix until you couldn't mix anymore. You thought you had it. And then you take the next day, well, you go home and you sleep, and you come back the next day and you do your final tweaks, and that was it. And that's the way for 30 years mixes were done. Now that we're mixing in the box, it's all different. So we used to be able to say, okay, it takes, you know, 12 hours for a mix, 8 hours the first day and 4 hours the next day, or something like that, some combination. Now it's different, and because you don't mix everything over the course of one day, most mixers that are mixing in the box will mix for something for 4 hours, and then they'll go on, they'll mix something else, or they'll take a break or something and come back, and over the course of many days or weeks sometimes, they'll put a lot of hours into a mix, and it might be 8 hours and it might be 20 hours. So it's hard to say exactly what that will be. Elliot Shiner, who's a great mixer and does, you know, a lot for, well, does the Eagles and Steely Dan. That's pretty good. But recently also did Beyonce as well. He can get a mix in 3 or 4 hours sometimes. And you know who else is like that is another famous mixer, and I can't think of his name. I can see his face in my mind, and actually he does a lot of R&B and he does a lot of hip hop, and he can do mixes in the same amount of time, you know, in 3 or 4 hours. Not all of them, but sometimes you'll get a mix that just works in that 3 or 4 hours. and other times it will take a lot of tweaking. One thing I will say is that usually mixes that you tweak, especially with automation, they tend to sound more modern because we're used to hearing that now. We're used to hearing a lot of automation happening. So it tends to be a more modern sound. If you're not looking for that sound, then usually there's less automation. And when I say less automation, I mean just fader automation and mutes. When you get into muting, when you get into effects, for instance, so in other words, you're automating effects, you're automating EQs, things like that. That's much more of a modern sound. So it depends. What I would say is when your mix can hang with something that you hear in the radio, and I'm going to use the radio, it might not be your type of music, but just as an example of something that a lot of people listen to. When you feel your mix can hang with that, then you can feel, pretty good that you're finished. So get, some mixes of some of your favorite artists, some of your favorite bands, and constantly compare back and forth. And when you feel that you have a mix that's, in the ballpark, you're never going to make it sound exactly like it, but when it's in the ballpark, when it can hang, yeah, then, it's a pretty good time to say, well, I think I'm finished. I do know that there comes a point in time where, no matter what you do, you don't make it sound better. It just sounds different. So, and this happens with artists a lot, where an artist will say, can you boost the hi-hat by 0.5 dB in the second verse? And you say, wait, no one's ever going to hear this. You're the only person that maybe will hear this, and probably not. And in 2 weeks, you're going to forget where we boosted. So, there comes a point where it is diminishing returns, and usually that's when you're making things sound different. Hard call. That's why producers are around, because producers will usually say, okay, we're done. That's it. And let's see. Alberto says, your thoughts on how to record a bass? Is going direct to a mixer through a DI box a good option compared to going through a preamp, miking and bass amp? Well, again, it's the sound you're looking for. Excuse me, I need a drink here as I talking a lot here for the last hour. There's not one thing that works all the time, because every song is different, every arrangement is different. All the players are different in many cases. So there's so many variables that you can't say one thing is going to always work. If I have my choice, I'll always have a direct bass sound. And the reason why is if I have the direct, I can re-mic it later. If I want to put it through an amplifier, I can and re-record it. So if I always make sure I get a great bass DI sound, because I can make it sound any way from there. Doesn't matter. So that's usually my priority. If you, and again, a DI with the bass, a DI makes a huge difference in terms of which one you use. I highly recommend that you spend the money and get a radial JDI. So it's Radial Engineering is the name of the company, and get a JDI. So J as in Jay-Z, D as in Don, and I as in Imus. And that one box will make your bass sound better, and it's about $200. They don't discount them, so it's $200 probably everywhere. That will do more for the sound of your bass than anything you can do, because it will give you more low end, and it will just make it sound better than anything you can possibly do. So I would recommend get that first, record that way, and a lot of your bass problems, your bass sound problems, will be over. Okay, Randy says, Bobby, curious if you use a MIDI fader or knob controller to perform automations on effects plugins, or do you prefer a mouse? Yes, Alberto, Radial JDI, that's it. I used to use MIDI fader, and I don't anymore. I found that I'm perfectly happy mixing with the mouse. I don't do all that much mixing with the mouse in terms of automation. It's mostly drawing automation in. It's one of the things I hated on analog consoles, because in analog consoles, you had to do a dozen passes to get the automation written correctly. And when I could just draw it in a second, I could have it in no time. So most of the time I know what I want the automation to do, so I'll draw it in. There are times you don't want to do that. There are times when you want a human element to it, and especially on a vocal, especially on something like on toms, for instance. You want to push the toms a little bit in certain places. And if that's the case, then I'll usually use a mouse, and I'm quite happy with it rather than a fader. The mouse is a little more precise for me personally. That being said, I know people that would never do that and would always use some sort of fader, and people have to have lots of faders. But it's really across the board. You'd be surprised the number of mixers that would say I have to have faders, and a number that says I'm fine with the mouse. And it's not only there's a lot of older engineers, classic guys that are just with the mouse these days and are perfectly fine with it. So it's doesn't mean that older guys have to use faders. That's not the case. Richard says, really enjoy your blog topics lately. Thank you, Richard. I'm glad that you do, and I'm real happy that I can do that for you here. I'm looking at the poll, and as far as the modules, everybody has kind of the same for all of them. Well, good. I'm glad you like I'm glad you're enjoying the course. At this point in time, I think we've pretty much answered everything. So again, thank you for being here, and you can hear a replay of this. It'll be posted within the next hour or so on the 101 Mixing Tricks site under Q&A. So once again, thank you for being here, and thanks for being part of 101 Mixing Tricks. And again, if you have any questions at all, anytime, either post it in the comments section, post it on the forum, or send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions anytime. So once again, thank you so much, and I hope that we'll do this soon. Next time, I hope to see you again on the webinar. Thanks a lot, everybody.